AMD stock finished Friday's session at $157.39, down just over 50 cents on the day. On the surface, it was a modest decline, less than 0.5%, but it came at the end of a volatile week where investors had to digest a swirl of headlines. From Intel and Nvidia announcing a multi-billion-dollar partnership, to export approval news for AMD's MI308 chip, to a Federal Reserve rate cut that rippled through the tech sector, there was no shortage of catalysts moving sentiment. The question now, as we head into the weekend and look toward next week's trade, is whether this pullback is a buying signal or just a pause in what has been a powerful AI-driven rally. To unpack that, let's start with Friday's market action. AMD opened with some weakness, trading in the red for most of the session, but the selling pressure was far from dramatic. The close at 157 and change marked only a 53-cent decline, which in the context of the stock's recent swings hardly registers as a major move. That in itself is telling. It suggests that despite competitive headlines and ongoing macro uncertainty, AMD's investor base remains steady. This wasn't panic selling, and it wasn't a sharp rejection of the stock. Instead, it looked like the market taking a breather after a news-heavy week. The first piece of news weighing on sentiment continues to be the Intel-Nvidia alliance. When two of AMD's biggest rivals announce a $5 billion tie-up, it's natural for investors to wonder what that means for AMD. Nvidia is the undisputed leader in AI accelerators, and Intel, while struggling in recent years, still carries weight in CPUs and is trying to reinvent itself through its foundry strategy. The optics of the deal make it look like AMD is being boxed out, with two giants linking arms. But scratch beneath the surface and the picture is more nuanced. Nvidia turning to Intel's foundry is less about sidelining AMD and more about Nvidia's own supply chain challenges. Demand for AI chips is so overwhelming that even TSMC's advanced capacity isn't enough. By turning to Intel, Nvidia is diversifying, but it's also admitting it needs outside help. That doesn't necessarily weaken AMD, it simply underscores how big the opportunity in AI has become. For AMD, the real story is execution. Lisa Su has been consistent in her message that we are in the early years of a decade-long AI infrastructure cycle. The MI300 accelerator is already finding homes with major customers like Microsoft, Oracle, and Meta, and the MI350 is expected to build on that foundation. Meanwhile, the MI400 roadmap, targeted for 2026, has been positioned as a no-compromise generation that could seriously challenge Nvidia's dominance. That's not just marketing spin. Analysts who've seen the roadmap believe AMD could genuinely take double-digit share in data center GPUs if execution is strong. So while Intel and Nvidia grab headlines with their alliance, AMD keeps moving forward with products, customers, and ecosystem growth. The export approval news around AMD's MI308 chip is another factor worth highlighting. For months, one of the biggest overhangs on AMD and other chipmakers has been the uncertainty around US-China export restrictions. Investors have worried that limits on AI chip sales to China could cut off a key growth market. The approval of MI308 exports helps ease those concerns, at least in part. It shows that regulators are willing to grant licenses where appropriate, and that AMD can still participate in the Chinese market even as restrictions remain in place. That's a positive development that shouldn't be overlooked, especially since geopolitical risk has been one of the main headwinds for semiconductor stocks. Then there's the macro backdrop. The Federal Reserve's decision to cut interest rates this week was the first step in what could be a series of cuts. In theory, lower rates support growth stocks by reducing the discount applied to future earnings. Tech and semiconductors tend to benefit in these environments. However, markets don't always move in straight lines. Some investors may have used the news as an opportunity to take profits, especially in names that have rallied hard this year. AMD's modest decline on Friday could reflect that dynamic. Rather than a rejection of the long-term story, it may simply have been a day when some investors locked in gains after a choppy week. On the competitive front, it's true that AMD faces pressure. Nvidia is still the market leader in AI chips, Intel is trying to reinvent itself, and Chinese firms are aggressively developing their own solutions. But this competition is also validation. Companies don't pour billions into partnerships and R&D if the opportunity isn't enormous. The AI chip market is projected to grow into the hundreds of billions over the coming decade, and no single player can meet that demand alone. For AMD, the challenge is clear: carve out and hold a meaningful slice of that pie. And based on its progress with MI300 adoption, its strengthening ROCm software stack, and its growing credibility with hyperscalers, AMD is well on its way. It's also worth talking about valuation. Even with all the AI hype, AMD trades at a significant discount to Nvidia on a forward earnings basis. Some of that is justified, because Nvidia's ecosystem lead is real and entrenched. But as AMD demonstrates execution, wins customers, and ramps revenue from AI accelerators, that gap could narrow. Analysts from Truist and Melius have raised their price targets into the 200s, arguing that the current valuation underestimates AMD's potential. For long-term investors, that's an important consideration. A stock that looks fairly priced today could look cheap in hindsight if growth materializes faster than expected. Friday's close around $157 also puts AMD near an important technical support zone. The 155 to 160 range has acted as a floor multiple times this year. Each time AMD has tested it, buyers have stepped in and defended the level. That pattern suggests accumulation, big investors using dips as entry points rather than abandoning the stock. If that support continues to hold, it could set the stage for the next leg higher. Conversely, if it breaks, we could see further downside. But for now, the fact that AMD closed the week steady, despite all the noise, is a sign of resilience. Looking ahead, the catalysts for AMD remain clear. Product announcements, customer adoption updates, and the November Analyst Day will all be closely watched. Any signs that hyperscalers are expanding their use of MI300 or MI350 accelerators will fuel the bull case. Continued progress on ROCm, making it easier for developers to port workloads from CUDA, will also be a key narrative. On the macro side, further clarity on export rules and continued rate cuts could act as tailwinds. On the flip side, competitive announcements from Nvidia, Intel, or Chinese firms will always create volatility. That's the nature of this space. So, is AMD's pullback on Friday a buying signal or just a pause? The answer depends on your time horizon. For traders, it may simply be part of the chop, a range-bound stock waiting for a catalyst. But for long-term investors, the ingredients for upside are still intact. AMD has the products, the roadmap, and the customers to participate meaningfully in the AI boom. It's not without risks. Execution, competition, and geopolitics all matter, but the potential reward remains significant. As we head into the weekend and look toward next week's trade, investors should keep perspective. Headlines about Intel and Nvidia partnering are important, but they don't erase AMD's progress. Export approvals for MI308, steady support near $157, and analyst upgrades all point to a company that remains on track. The pullback we saw on Friday wasn't a collapse. It was a pause. And pauses, in the context of a long-term growth story, often present opportunity. The coming week will likely bring more volatility. That's the nature of the semiconductor sector. But for investors who believe in the decade-long AI cycle, AMD remains one of the most compelling ways to participate. The stock's modest dip on Friday may have some worried, but when you look past the noise, the long-term narrative is still firmly intact. And that's why, even after a week filled with competitive headlines, macro shifts, and modest declines, the real story this weekend is not about what AMD lost. It's about the opportunity that still lies ahead.